Hey, so a few weeks ago, I bought this awesome Electron Octatrack, and the reason I bought it was I specifically wanted to use it so that I could take songs that I've built up in Ableton and then extract them out of Ableton with a view to playing them live via the Octatrack. And the thing that I really wanted out of this was such that the Octatrack would give me the flexibility to change things up, to mangle things, resample it, resequence it, so that when I'm playing live, the songs are a little bit different, or they can be different each time, or I can even play around and mess around with things live on the fly if I feel like it. And the Octatrack also makes a really great heart of a live rig because it's got the 4 inputs and 2 outputs. So 2 outputs go straight to the mixer, and I've got my 4 inputs, so I can bring with me a couple of synths or a synth and a drum machine. Just a whole lot of flexibility. And with the 8 tracks for audio and 8 tracks for MIDI, I can also use it to add sort of MIDI parts that wouldn't have otherwise been present in the Ableton session, just for the sake of playing them live and doing something a little bit different with them. So I used it for one live show already, but I used it pretty simply then. I just outputted each of my songs that I was playing as sort of 4 or 5 part stems and just played the stems from end to end, which is totally fine use of the Octatrack. The great thing about it is that it can stream samples straight from its CF card, so each sample or stem can be 2 gig, which is fine for a full song. Or there's also the mode of loading samples out of RAM if you need a little bit more flexibility as to what you can do with the sample for editing it on the fly. But then what I wanted to go sort of the next level of depth here and really be able to resequence, resample, change the loops and slice things up and move things around to give a song a new life when I'm playing it live. I needed to get to the point where I was extracting things out of Ableton as loops that I could then slice up, and then the real magic of what you can do with the Octatrack starts. So I'm going to walk you through the workflow that I've come up with for doing exactly that. And this is about version 52 of this workflow. It was a lot of trial and error and a lot of help from folks along the way. So thank you for everyone that helped. And I'm sure I'll learn more as I try to do this. The first thing we're going to do is let's flip over to looking at Ableton here. The key to success here I found was knowing what your limitations are and then doing some work to organize the project around those limitations to make it easier for you once you start programming things into the Octatrack. So your basic limitations you're working with the Octatrack is it's 8 audio tracks, but really one of those is going to be your master track, and that's optional, but you're going to want to do that so that you've got the master track there and you can apply effects to the master. I also use a track as a looper that I can record stuff on the fly and loop around to do fades and transitions between songs. So really it's 6 tracks of audio. So in my Ableton projects here, it was actually a really good exercise in going through and reorganizing my Ableton projects. So I organized them into groups. So I have a group for bass, a lead 1 part, a lead 2, a lead 3, and then drums, and then MISC is everything else that I don't actually need for getting the song out of Ableton and into the Octatrack. But the first thing that I found really helpful to do is to sort of wrap my head around where in this song are the different parts and patterns. So with the Octatrack, as I mentioned before, you've got your 8 tracks of audio, which is really about 6 or 7 usable, and your 8 tracks of MIDI, but I'm not using any MIDI tracks at this point. But then when it comes down to sequencing things, you've got a bunch of different banks and 16 banks, and each of those banks has 16 patterns in it. And I'm trying to stick to a model of a bank per song. You don't have to do that. You could do, your song could span 1 bank, 2 bank, 3 banks, whatever you want if you want to make it really complicated. But to keep things simple and to force myself into a limitation that I think is good and healthy to have, I'm doing a bank per song. So for each song, I need to break it down into 16 patterns or 16 sections, for lack of a better term. And then the other thing that took me a while to wrap my head around with the Octatrack is that it has this notion of parts. And at first I thought the hierarchy was that you had banks and those banks contained parts and each of those parts contained patterns, but that's not it. So you have your bank, and again I do bank per song, And then each bank I have 16 patterns. And those I think of as like the different loops or different little sections of the song. Parts are kind of peers to patterns, where each pattern you couldn't say this pattern uses part 1, or this pattern uses part 2, or this pattern uses part 3 and part 4. And you can think of patterns as basically groups or profiles of samples. So taking a look at this example of this song that I've got here, I started adding these little locators up the top here and on the timeline in Ableton, just to start giving me a sort of insight into starting to think about where the patterns start and stop and which part I might actually be using. So I found this really helpful. So I listened to the song and I'd think, okay, this bit here is an 8-bar loop. And obviously it's my first set of loops that I'm playing. So it's probably just going to be, it's probably just part 1. Because it's going to be the first set of samples I'm using, and it was actually just some drums and this lead 3 part here. But that's my first pattern, and it's 8 bars. I try to keep the patterns to either 4 bars or 8 bars, or maybe 16. The reason being that the maximum step length in a pattern is 64 steps. So if I want to stick to 16 steps per bar, that means a 4-bar loop is my 64 steps. You can change that. You can have it so that one pattern is 64 steps, but at half the speed, so that you essentially got twice the amount of audio time for the number of steps in the pattern. Or you can go the other direction and have more granularity and resolution. But by default, you're working with 64 steps in the pattern, which is 16 steps per bar. So you're a 4-bar loop, which is so easy to just kind of think around a 4-bar loop. But in this case, I actually know that it's 8 bars at the start here, but it's just the same 4-bar pattern looped. So I could just say this is pattern 1 using part 1 because it's this group of samples, and I'll let that pattern play twice. Then I'm going to go on to pattern 2 because I'm bringing in now this other set of loops that go for 4 bars, and also another drum part here. And then I've got my next pattern, which is because I'm bringing in now more samples or more tracks start playing, I want it to be another pattern, so I can trigger those. And then we go into part 4, which again, this is when the song really starts and we've got sort of a lot of tracks playing. So I want to trigger all these samples playing and actually let this one loop for 1, 2, 3, lots of 4 bars. Then I go into pattern 5 here, which has a 4-bar loop, which is sort of the out of that section. And then here in pattern 6, I realize that this is the first time I need to use a new part. And the reason for that is that there's differences in some of the samples. Like looking at the drums down here, for example, whereas in part 1, I was mostly using this pink colored sort of loop here, this sort of, I call it a scratchy beat. It's like just a little scratchy kind of sampled beat with a tambourine hit. But then when we get into sort of what starts here at pattern 6, then I've got this different sampled beat, which is a lot heavier, and it's going to be a totally different loop that's playing. And that I'm going to use part 2, because then when I'm in pattern 1 and I'm using when I'm in patterns 1 through 5 using part 1, that locks in that set of samples per track. But then when I go to pattern 6 and I'm saying I'm using part 2, that means I can assign a new set of samples to each of my tracks. Now, of course, you can use sample locks to change the sample for each individual step in a pattern. But honestly, I'm trying to only use that when I as a sort of get out of jail free card, when I've got, something where just for this bar, I'd use a different sample, or just for this section, I use a different set of samples. And it's not really indicative of that same group of samples that I'm going to use over a bunch of different patterns. So I went through and went to the trouble of doing this throughout the whole song. You see all these locator things up here. And the other good thing about this exercise is that if you get through your song and adding all these locators and you're more than 16, then you're going to need to economize. Or you could move to more than 1 bank per song. But sticking in the model of bank per song, if you're at more than 16 patterns or 16 different sections of your song by the end of it, you're going to need to think of ways to cut that down. And there's lots of tricks you could do, but for example, like in here, in this pattern 6, which is using part 2 in my little 6:2 notation up here, it runs for 4 lots of 4 bars. But I'm actually only going to cut a 4-bar loop of these and just let that same loop, for this I'm going to actually cut a 16-bar loop, trigger that once in the pattern, and just set it as a one-time trig. So once this pattern, first time it loops through, it's going to trigger all my samples, and the samples last for the full 16 bars here. But although it's just a 4-bar pattern that's looping over, it still means I can get the full 16 bar of these patterns played, because the other important thing to wrap your head around with the Octatrack is it does what it's doing and will keep doing what it's doing until you tell it to do something else. So if you start a pattern and trigger a sample that's, say, 16, 32, or even 100 and something bars long, it'll keep playing that even though the 4-bar pattern's looping over if you use a one-shot trigger. It's kind of a neat way to say, start this pattern and maybe it loops for 4 bars because there's other 4-bar parts playing, but you could trigger one sample which starts playing and it just keeps going for longer if you set it up as a 1-bar trig. So that's one way to sort of economize on the number of patterns you're using to make them last longer, and I'm sure there's lots of other techniques there. So once I've got these sort of individual patterns laid out and decided how I'm going to sort these out into sections, into parts, then what I went about is just starting to render each of these out as the individual loops I want. And again, I try and keep these loops to 4 bars wherever possible, and only longer when I want them to actually run for a longer period without looping over themselves. And just a couple of tricks for actually doing that. Like, for example, if my lead group here is actually made of like 6 different tracks that play at different things, but really what I just want is I want to get a 4-bar loop of this whole group. And so using the group track here, I select the 4 bars that I want there. And in Ableton, you can do Command-Shift-R, or you can go up to the menu and do export. But when you're exporting, it's always important to say here, selected tracks only. And in doing that, I could just hit export now, and what it's going to do is just render out a 4-bar loop for just that part of that group. But it's going to be all these 6 tracks, but just that little 4-bar section. So you go through and do this and pick out all the little individual slices of audio that you think you're going to need to reconstruct your song in the Octatrack. And I'm generally finding that I'm ending up with anywhere from 10 to 12, and sometimes up to 20 loops, depending on how complicated the song is. But it'll all depend on what your style and construction is. Just a thing to note, when you're outputting the loops, like for example, if I was going to go and slice this, get a 4-bar loop for this, this lead 2 track in this part here, what I'd always do is hit solo on this and just hit play to make sure I'm actually really sure that's definitely the audio I want. There's not something else creeping in, or I'm not, picking up something I don't, or I'm not missing out on tracks that I think are in this that are not. And then once I've soloed it and played it back, then do I do the export, make sure it's hit selected tracks only, and export that out to create the loop. One thing that's going to really help you is the naming convention you use for your loops. So this song here, the plan, it actually ended up being all these loops once I broke it out. And I think there's about 20 or so there, maybe more. Let's have a look. So 23. But I landed on this naming convention, and it's a great trick that I hope helps folks out. The first thing is that I'm putting together a 4-song set, and when you're doing that in the Octatrack, all of your samples go into this one audio pool. And when you've got samples from 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or even more songs, that pool gets really complicated to navigate really quickly. So the first thing I put in all of my samples across all of these songs is just a number that indicates which track or which song they belong to. So the first song in this set is 1000. That's the name of it, and I put a 1 at the start of all my samples for that. The second song in the set is the plan, and all these samples start with 2. Third song in the set is going to be draft, and again, all those samples start with a 3. You'll see why that's important on the Octatrack when we get to loading these up. The other thing to keep in mind in your Octatrack is display space is at a premium. The display is small and it's got very little space to actually see all the full file name of things. So I adopted a scheme of like 2 or 3 letters to describe what the instrument is. Like here we've got drums or bass 1 or lead 1 or lead 2, lead 3 or vocals. Then after that, quick 3, 4, maybe 5 letter mnemonic to tell me what the track, like something that'll remind me what this sample is, like lead 1 ding, or lead 3 4 rise, or drum crash and kick. But again, keep it really short and just so you can quickly identify what this sample is on a small display. And the last part is always put the bar length of the sample in there. It's so much easier when you get to wanting to slice these and you kind of think, well, how many slices do I really want? How much resolution is that going to give me? Put the number of bars in the file name just so it's so much easier for you. All right, so we've taken our Ableton project, we've divided it up into our patterns and our parts. We've got our loops that construct this whole song rendered out. Now we're going to upload them to the Octatrack. So if we flip over here to looking at the view of the Octatrack, I've got a completely blank set and project here. And the first thing we're going to do is function project. Sorry, no, that's wrong. We're going to go to project, system, use USB disk mode, yes. So now it's in disk mode, and if we flip back to the computer display, we see that, open up a new window just to keep this easier. In my computer here, we've got the Octatrack as a volume, which is the CF card within the Octatrack. And the set that I created for this video is called Workflow. And in there, the Octatrack creates for you a folder called Audio. So I'm going to go ahead and just dump those full set of samples that I created straight into the audio folder here. Make sure you let them copy. And all right, we're done. And at this point, we can just eject the Octatrack because we're finished with it now. And the cool thing is when you eject it, you don't actually have to do anything else on the Octatrack itself. It goes straight back into the mode ready to operate. It pulls itself out of disk mode. All right, so I am in bank 1, pattern 1, completely blank canvas here. I've got my tracks here. Now the layout I'm going to use for this is, I think in this song I've got a bass track, lead 1, lead 2, lead 3. Track 5 I tend to gravitate towards making that my drums. 6 is for one-shots, things like a crash cymbal or just a vocal hit that happens at some point. Track 7 I use as a looper so that I can record on the fly and loop while I'm transitioning between songs. And then track 8 will be the master track. And in fact, we need to set that up. So we'll say project, control, audio, track 8 is our master. Okay, done. All right, let's load up our samples. What I did there was I just went to my first track and double tapped it. This brings up the static machine configuration where I determine what sample I want on that track. It's all blank at the moment, but I use the arrow keys here to say for slot 1, brings up our file browser. I want files in the directory plan, and check it out. Here's all our samples that we just loaded onto the Octatrack. And I'm sorry you can't see it very well on the screen, but I assure you they're all the samples we just loaded. And notice how they're like just fitting into the size of the window here. That's why you got to economize on sample length, right? Make sure it makes sense with a very short file name, but that you can still at a glance, after days, weeks, or however long, can still make sense of what sample does what and how long it is. So this is my bass track, so I'm going to load up the first sample here. Now, here's a neat trick. The Octatrack allows you to really quickly load up all those samples to all these slots at once, and you just basically keep hitting the right arrow key, and what this does is it just cycles on to the next slot and the next sample and next slot, next sample, next slot, next sample, next slot, The only thing you've got to be careful to do is just make sure that it is actually picking up new samples as you load this, okay? And so that's the end of it. We've loaded up all of our samples. Get back to our machine configuration here. So notice now in the static sample pool list, I've now got my 23 sample slots filled for this first song. This is our bass track, and I'm going to load up the bass sample for it. And then back here, I'm going to say track 2, we're going to load up our, let's say our first lead part. I think I've got one here that I call lead soft, which is how the song starts. Track 3, I'm going to load up our second lead part. There's one here called 4 rise. And third one here. Do we have a third lead for this one? I'm not sure. Yeah, we do, but it looks like it's, yeah, we have a sample there that's 4 bars. 5 I use for my drum track, and the reason for that is it's just nice and easy to remember that this is like bass, leads, and other parts, and harmonies, and melodies, and whatever. Then up here is your drums. Just if you want to quickly access things and play around with it live, it's good to always know where the drum track is. Load that drum sample as the main sample, and that's all I need. I'm just going to do that to start messing around here. So I've got pattern 1, and we're in, get out of the sample list here. So now we've got our samples assigned to the tracks that we want to start building up our song or recreating our song. But we need to add triggers. Triggers is basically saying play this sample from this track on this, this position in the pattern. So we're in pattern 1. Hit the record button to enter grid editing mode, which just allows us to add our triggers. And let's say bass, let's start just playing each of these songs on the first trigger, okay? And we've sort of done this flying blind, but this should at least give us a start of this song. Let's see what it sounds like. Okay, cool. So we've got some audio coming through there, which is great. And then what I do is I just keep sort of on one screen here, when I'm doing this, I've got my, where's my Ableton session? Here we go. I keep my Ableton session loaded, and I look at my first pattern here, and I said, okay, well, pattern 1 was this, only these 2 samples on these tracks, and so I just add triggers for those. Then I move on to my next pattern, and I go through the same process of working out, okay, where I thought with pattern 2 started in this session, what samples do I need to trigger, load them up and make sure they're on the tracks, and fire them off. And just a note on using the parts. So let's say we programmed in our pattern 1, we programmed in pattern 2, 3, we've gone 4, 5, then we get to pattern 6, and remember pattern 6 in this song is where I wanted to start using a different part because it's suddenly a different set of samples playing on each track. For that, once I'm in pattern 6, I go to the part menu and switch it to say I want part 2. Now, when I'm in pattern 6 here, and I start changing the samples that are assigned to each of these tracks, what that means is the changes that I'm making on pattern 6 that are using part 2, they won't affect patterns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are using part 1, nor would they affect any pattern that's using parts 3 and part 4. So it's like a profile of your samples. Sounds simple now, took me way too long to wrap my head around. Always pays to read the manual, obviously, if you're patient enough to try and do that. All right, I think that covers the basics of like reconstructing the song. Obviously, it's a bit of a time-consuming process to go through each of these patterns and set up the triggers for the samples you want to play so that you can recreate what you had in Ableton. But it's kind of that's the investment you need to make to do what I wanted to do, which is I wanted to take the song as it is in Ableton, recreate it on the Octatrack, and then be able to mess around with it on the Octatrack. So what I'm going to do now is just load up a set and project that I've been working on, you know, the old proverbial, here's one I prepared earlier. So let's change up this, we'll change set to this set here in this project. And it loads it up. And I'm still on the computer, so let's flip over to the Octatrack. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm on the Octatrack, and I've now loaded up my project from what I've been working on earlier. And I'm going to go to bank 2 part 1 because that's the start of this song. Now, I'm just going to get my headphones so I can hear what we're playing here. Now, when I start playing this, I've got this quiet loop here, but let's delve into the song. Okay, so song's playing, we've got a bass part, we've got sort of that sort of rising bass sort of sound, and then the drum track. Now, what if I wanted to totally change the way the bass sounds? So bass is on this track here, and at the moment all I've got to do is just doing this one trigger to kick off this 4-bar loop. It's just that simple do 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 the bass line. Let's do something fun with it though. Let's go into so we're on this track 1 for the bass, and what I want to do is enter the audio editor by hitting AED, and we're going to slice this up and say yes. And what I want to do is create a slice grid. Now I know this is a 4-bar loop. Why do I know this? Because the file name is actually shown up there even though you can't see it, and I can see 4-bar because I was smart and put that in the name. I learned this the hard way though. So I want 64 slices, that way I've got 16 slices per bar. Yep, I'll line it to 0. Now my bass part is all sliced up. Now, Gaz taught me a really cool trick here, which I'm not sure if I can actually replicate, but what you can now do is do something here. Yeah, here we go. You can create linear locks and random locks, because at the moment, this one trigger that I've got here, all that's going to do is kick off that first slice. So our bass line's going to sound pretty dead. So actually, let's hear it. And of course, it's made a liar out of me. Why does it make a liar? Ah, because we've sliced it, but we haven't yet told the Octatrack we want to be in slice mode in terms of playing this sample. So we go back to our source here, double tap on source configuration, and where it says slice off, we now slice on. Slice off, slice on. So now that we're on slice mode for this, each trigger will only play that slice. So now if we play this again, right, see how that do bass line's gone and it's just this one little part of it. So what we could do, we could just add a bunch of other triggers in other places. And now we've kind of got you know, a totally different bass line. This is obviously set up for 4 bars, which just for the sake of this, I'm going to set it back down to 1 bar just so we can fiddle around with this loop easily. So yeah, we could change this bass pattern just to give the song some variety, make it different when we play it live, or even just, you know, while you're playing this, you could even do this so that you're getting a different bass line each time. But right now, each time I've added this trigger, it's actually still playing that first slice. And we can see this because the start here is set to slice 1. Now, if I turn these off, and let's go back into 4-bar mode. So we want 16 steps in the pattern. And back in our audio editor, slice mode, we're going to create these linear locks. Alter all the triggers, I am sure. Okay, what that's going to mean is each of these, if we enable these, is actually going to play a different slice, slice 1 through 16. So that's a neat way to recreate that same pattern, and hopefully that's exactly what we've achieved. Not quite. Interesting effect though. All right, let's see why that didn't work. Go back into record mode. Okay, so it didn't quite work as I expected, but what we could do we can create the trigger here, and we can manually edit the slice. So each of these, as I enable them, I'm just telling it to say the next slice. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. See how good I am at counting? Really getting better at it. Before we know it, I'll be able to play in time. All right, slices 1 through 16. And again, for simplicity, because the other trick didn't work, thanks Gaz, let's go back to 1-bar mode here. So we're just 16 steps. All right, so that's our original bass line, but now we're instead of playing it, just kicking it off as a sample that just starts on here and runs for 4 bars, we're actually playing each individual slice. Why is this cool? Because now we could say, maybe here we'll play slice 2, up here 11, and I'm just totally picking these at random just for the sake of level up on this so we can hear it a bit clearer. Let's silence the other tracks. So see how we're now starting to evolve our bass line. Already that's like a little bit more exciting, different, and interesting compared to what the original loop was. And of course, the sample that the slice we're playing is just the start of this. Right? I mean, we could do weird stuff like take maybe this one, we pitch it differently. Oh, that's cool. Lots of different stuff we can do. But this was exactly what I wanted, was that now I don't just have my static stems that I'm playing exactly as they were in Ableton. When I go and play this live, it's going to be different. It's got more variety. It's more exciting, more engaging. So I'm really excited to see what I can do with this. Let's see how it sounds all together. Maybe a little bit too busy, but this was just an experiment. All right, so that's my current version of my workflow for getting a song out of Ableton in a sane manner, and then resequencing it onto the Octatrack so that we recreate it as it was in Ableton onto the Octatrack, and then get ourselves in a position to start really changing things up. Hope this helps.